The circle of fifths is a very powerful tool you can use to write great chord progressions, though most people don't know this and they dismiss the circle of fifths as either something that's really confusing or even useless. But since you're watching this video, you are more clever and curious than the average person, which is great because by the end of this video, you'll have a solid understanding of the practical application of the circle of fifths, how you can use it to compose compelling chord progressions that sound awesome. In fact, the real circle of fifths is so much cooler than how it's traditionally depicted, as a dusty, abstract ring of key signatures that's meant to distinguish which notes are the accidentals or sharps and flats in each key. To start out, we're going to take a quick look at how these key signatures are formed to gain a kind of X-ray vision, which is a critical step to see past all of these symbols to really understand what the circle of fifths is actually showing us in order to use it as a tool for songwriting. So the circle of fifths basically shows how all keys, how all major scales are connected, where they're all linked to form one big daisy chain pattern. Starting with the key of C, for example, the C major scale is made from a pattern of whole step and half step intervals to make. And then if we take the second half of that scale, starting on the fifth note, G, and repeat the pattern, we get the G major scale. Then continuing on, starting on the fifth note, D, of that scale, when we repeat the same pattern of whole steps and half steps, it forms the D major scale. And so on, where we can cycle through all 12 major scales until we eventually return to C major once again. This is how the circle of fifths is created and why it's called the circle of fifths, because it shows how each respective key, how each new scale is built starting on the fifth note of the previous one. Looking at it like this, you can see how this loop is really just a big keyboard that cycles through each key, where C major is at the top, which leads to the G major scale, then D and A, etc. And notice how the black and white keys explain all of the sharp and flat symbols in the traditional depiction of the circle of fifths. The C major scale is played using all of the white notes on a keyboard. So that's why in this diagram, this key signature representing the key of C is empty, because the C major scale has no accidentals, no black notes of sharps or flats. But in the G major scale, there's one black note, F sharp, which is why the key signature for G is shown with an F sharp. Likewise, the D major scale has two black notes, F sharp and C sharp, as also depicted in the key signature for the key of D. And continuing on in a clockwise direction, each major scale has an increasing number of sharps, just as each respective key moving in a counterclockwise direction from C has progressively more flats. The F major scale has one black note, B flat, depicted here in the old circle of fifths. The B flat major scale has two black notes, B flat and E flat, and so on, moving in this direction. That was just a quick look at why the circle of fifths is usually depicted as key signatures. And if we were to stop there, as most people do, we would totally be missing the point, because this old depiction really is and should be a museum piece today. It's close and yet still so far away, because this old depiction of the circle of fifths as key signatures emphasizes the differences between keys rather than the important connections between them. So forget about the sharps and flats, they don't really matter. Instead, notice how the circle of fifths is formed through a consistent repeating pattern of whole step and half step intervals, where the second half of C forms the first half of G, and the second half of G forms the first half of D, and the second half of D is the first half of A, all the way around the circle so that every major scale, every key in music overlaps. This connection between keys is the insight that we need here. And to picture these connections more directly, more intuitively, we can apply the color wheel like this to visually highlight the fact that G, for example, red-orange, is made from equal parts C, red, and D, orange, and that D, orange, is equal halves G, red-orange, and A, orange-yellow, etc., all around the circle. Just as all the keys in music overlap to form the circle of fifths, all the colors bleed seamlessly into one another in the color wheel. Both patterns, the color wheel and the circle of fifths, illustrate the same thing. And again, this connection between keys is really what we care about, because these harmonic connections, these relationships between keys and notes, are what inform everything in music, from scales and modes to chords and progressions, as we'll look at next. Okay, so now that we can see sound using these colors, let's simplify things by reducing the circle of fifths down to the 12 basic notes of music, and then rearrange these notes into the chromatic scale, since this is the sequence of notes we actually use to play instruments. Only now with the colors, we can see the harmonic relationships baked into the notes, which will help us a lot here. And from this pattern, let's pick out, say, the C major scale again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, in the key of C, we can derive 7 essential chords from this scale just by starting on each scale degree or interval and combining every other note to get C major, or the major 1 chord, D minor, or the minor 2, E minor, or the minor 3, F major, major 4, G major, major 5, A minor, minor 6, and B diminished, or the diminished 7 chord. In the key of C, as our example, you can arrange these chords in all sorts of ways to create cool chord progressions, like the popular 1, 5, 6, 4, 1, and the classic Pachelbel progression, and a virtually endless variety of other progressions. But what does this have to do with the circle of fifths? We are getting there, and it has to do with some special relationships between chords in a given key and across keys that are consistent that we can map in the circle of fifths to give us a framework of harmony. For example, looking at these chords in the key of C, notice how the colors of the different root notes highlight connections between them. Like C major, the root note is red, F major, the root note is purple-red, and G major, where the root note is red-orange. The root notes of these 3 major chords are neighbors in the circle of fifths, which is why they sound good together, like you hear in the common 1-4-5-1 progression. Because the 1-4-5-1 focuses on chords that are harmonically related, closely related in the circle of fifths, which again is easy to see with the colors here. And in the same way, you can also see how the root notes of the 3 minor chords in this key are also related. The root notes of D minor, the minor 2, A minor, the minor 6, and E minor, the minor 3, are likewise neighbors in the circle of fifths. So the circle of fifths is behind the scenes what's informing why these various chords sound good together. It's the metaphorical electrical powerhouse that's supplying the energy that lights up all of these harmonic connections between the chords in a given key, which in turn is why you can arrange these chords in all sorts of ways and they'll sound good because of their shared harmonic connections through the circle of fifths. But it gets even better. Because remember how the circle of fifths itself is formed by overlapping all of the neighboring major scales, where the second half of C major becomes the first half of G major, and then the second half of G major becomes the first half of D major, etc., so that all 12 keys bleed into each other? Well, just as all scales share some notes in common, all keys also share some chords in common, since these chords are derived from those scales. For example, the 7 chords in the key of C are, again, C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished based on the underlying notes of the C major scale. But since the G major scale shares some of these same notes, the key of G also includes some of the same chords as well. The G major scale is G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G, and the chords are G major, A minor, B minor, C major, D major, E minor, and F sharp diminished, where these chords, G major, A minor, C major, and E minor are also in the key of C. And if we look at all 12 keys, this same overlap is there, where some of the same chords show up in multiple keys due to the connections between keys in the circle of fifths. But of course, picturing all of the chords this way is a lot to take in. It's insightful, but not very concise. So a more compact way to look at the chords in each key and how they're related and overlap is to use the circle of fifths to arrange the various chords in a circle of fifths structure, and here's how. If we take all of the major chords and represent each one by its root note like this, and arrange them in order of the circle of fifths or the color wheel, it looks like this. Then if we add all of the minor chords, also shown by their root notes, and align each one with its respective major chord, so A minor is next to C major, E minor next to G major, and so on, we have 2 concentric rings of chords with major chords at the center and minor chords around that. And then around that, an outer ring of diminished chords where each is aligned with its respective major chord. So B diminished is above above C, F sharp diminished is above G, etc., all the way around the circle. Every ring of chords is arranged in a circle of fifths sequence, the major chords in the inner ring, the minor chords in the middle ring, and the diminished chords in the outer ring, but the respective rings are aligned so that the chords in each key are grouped together, like the chords in the key of C, and all the chords in the key of G, and those in the key of D, etc. This same grouping is consistent in every key since the circle of fifths is symmetrical and all the keys are formed from the same underlying pattern. But what's especially cool is that this single diagram also shows how the various chords overlap and intertwine, sharing some of the same chords between them. For example, while these chords are in the key of C and these are in the key of G, these four harmonies appear in both. Like a Venn diagram, you can see this overlap directly in the image. Likewise, keys G and D also have some chords in common, as do keys D and A, etc. So in one compact image, the circle of fifths gives us this kind of bird's eye view of all keys in music and every chord within them, including which chords appear in which keys. So you have this all-seeing insight that helps you navigate the different keys to compose chord progressions, informed by how the various harmonies relate to one another, which chords go together, like a palette of compatible harmonies you can use to paint your sonic pictures. It's good stuff. For example, the 1-5-6-4 progression that we played earlier in the key of C looks and sounds like this, where it's now more clear how these harmonies are related to each other, no matter what key you're in, since these relationships are consistent in every key. And with the Pachelbel progression as another example, you can see how these chords are connected in the circle of fifths as well, which is super helpful. So the circle of fifths is way more useful than if you just thought of it as a limited, dusty old reference guide to merely which keys have certain sharps or flats. The circle of fifths is actually very powerful for mastering chord progressions. And in the video notes, there's a link to a PDF in the community with these diagrams that you can soak in at your own pace. And here we've only scratched the surface because it gets even better, since the circle of fifths not only shows which chords are in what keys and where those keys overlap, but it also clarifies in one single image how all of the parallel modes in music are laid out, like the Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian modes, how they interact and which chords are found in each mode in all 12 keys. We look at parallel modes in the circle of fifths in another video because that's its own entire topic, though it's powerful because with parallel modes, you know where to borrow different chords to expand your songwriting palette to write unexpected and really interesting chord progressions, getting into modal mixture and cool stuff like that, which all the best composers do, like the Beatles and others. With parallel modes, you can do some really cool stuff. And just with the circle of fifths, this is an intro to the circle of fifths, so you can wrap your head around it to make sense of how you can come up with some really cool chord progressions, not just randomly picking chords out and hoping they sound good together, but knowing how they're all connected, how they're all related within a single diagram. So hopefully this was helpful. If so, please let the algorithm know, and I will see you in the next video.